She was standing in the same room, the same hall, the same ceremony, the same man she had loved before power turned him into something colder than stone. And he extended his hand. Not to her. In front of every elder, every council member, every witness his kingdom had assembled to watch his future be decided correctly. He chose her sister. He did not look at her once. Not with guilt. Not with apology. Not with a single breath of acknowledgement that something real, something that had existed between them before duty swallowed him whole, was being publicly executed in front of everyone she had ever known. She was simply part of the crowd. She walked out before the celebration began, and she carried something with her that no one in that hall knew existed. His children, 2 of them, already alive inside her, already carrying his blood, his power, his entire bloodline future. While he raised a glass to the wrong woman, she did not tell him. She did not beg. She did not confront. She did not give the system the satisfaction of watching her break. She disappeared, and for 5 years, he had no idea what he had lost. But he was about to find out. There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly. They arrive in the middle of a crowd. They arrive wearing the face of ceremony and tradition, and the collective approval of everyone who has ever held power over your fate. And they end something inside you so completely, so permanently, that the person who existed before that moment never fully returns. This was one of those moments. The hall was filled with the weight of expectation. Every elder, every council member, every pack loyalist who had spent decades building the architecture of this kingdom stood assembled in formal recognition of what was about to be decided. Banners moved in the draft from the open doors. Candles burned in arrangements that had been placed by hands trained in ceremonial precision. The space itself communicated the message that power intended to send. This is permanent, this is correct, and this has always been inevitable. She stood in the assembled crowd. Not on a platform. Not in a position of acknowledgement. She stood where the system had always placed her. In the space between significance and invisibility, close enough to witness everything, too far removed to matter to any of it. She had told herself she was prepared. She had spent weeks constructing the internal architecture of a woman who understood political reality. She had rehearsed the acceptance. She had told herself, in the quiet hours before dawn when honesty is harder to avoid, that she already knew what was coming. That the Alpha King was not simply a man she had loved. He was a king whose council had already decided the terms of his future long before he had the power to refuse them. That bloodline politics operated on its own mathematics, cold and indifferent to personal history. She had told herself all of this. It did not prepare her for the silence before he extended his hand. The Alpha King stood at the ceremony altar with the stillness of someone who had made his peace before walking into the room. There was no visible struggle in him. No hesitation in the set of his jaw, no shadow of conflict behind his eyes. He had calcified into the decision somewhere private, somewhere she had not been permitted to witness, and what stood at that altar was not the man she had known before power hardened him. It was the king his council had built him to be, making the choice his council had designed for him, with the composure of someone who had already buried the alternatives. He extended his hand. Not toward her. Her sister stepped forward. The sound that filled the hall was approval. The particular sound of a system recognizing itself in a decision, relieved that the architecture it had spent years constructing was being honored correctly. Elders nodded. Advisors exchanged the quiet relief of men who believed the future had just been secured. The pack settled into the warm certainty of a ceremony, proceeding exactly as intended. And she stood in the crowd and felt the specific, surgical quality of erasure that only comes from indifference. He did not look at her. Not once. Not with guilt. Not with apology. Not with the brief acknowledgement of a man who understands that something real is being surrendered in the execution of necessary duty. She did not exist in that hall to him. She was simply another face in the assembled witnesses, catalogued by his peripheral awareness as part of the approved audience for his future being correctly constructed. That was the thing that destroyed her. Not the rejection. Not the political machinery that had engineered the outcome. Not even her sister's hand accepting what had always been meant for someone else. It was the precision of his indifference. The ceremony did not know her name, and neither in that moment did he. She did not stay for the celebration. She walked, not ran, walked, because panic implies a loss of control. She refused to surrender in any space where the system's eyes could catalog her response. Through the hall, and through the grounds, and through the outer boundary of the pack's territory with the composure of a woman whose processing has not yet fully begun. The noise of celebration followed her in diminishing degrees. The sound of her sister's new future being toasted, formalized, absorbed into the pack's institutional memory. She walked until the sound was gone. She walked until there was only silence and the cold weight of the air, and the particular quality of darkness that exists outside the boundary of any world that has just decided you do not belong inside it. And then, truly alone, with no witness to catalogue the moment, in the specific privacy that only the completely overlooked are ever permitted, she allowed herself to know the second truth. The one that had been living inside her for weeks. The one that changed everything. She was pregnant. She had been for weeks before the ceremony. Before the political machinery accelerated to its conclusion. Before she understood that the bond she had believed was mutual had already been archived as historical. She carried inside her the Alpha King's children. Conceived in the time before duty fully calcified him, when he was still a man as much as a king, when the bond between them had felt like something neither of them had the language to fully name. She sat with that knowledge in the cold outside the boundary of everything she had known. She sat with the ceremony noise still faintly audible in the distance behind her. She sat with the full weight of what she was carrying, and what it meant, and what the system she had just watched operate with such efficient indifference would do to her children if she remained. The calculation did not take long. If she stayed, if she revealed the pregnancy to a pack still vibrating with the energy of its new Alpha Queen's installation, she became a political complication to be managed. Her children would be born into a structure that had already decided their existence was inconvenient. They would be acknowledged perhaps, documented perhaps, but fundamentally they would be instruments in someone else's political architecture, protected to the degree that protection served the pack's stability, discarded to whatever degree their existence challenged the legitimacy of their father's chosen alliance. She understood what the system did with complications. She had just watched it operate. The decision built itself with the cold, precise logic of a woman who has just understood, completely, finally, with no remaining room for self-deception, that she has been underestimated for the last time. She would disappear. Not in panic. Not in grief's immediate, reactive flight. She would disappear with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the quality of the exit determines the quality of everything that follows. She would leave no threads. No traceable paths. No administrative remnants that a pack's trackers could follow through the outer territories. And she would take the Alpha King's blood with her. The pack would not know what it had lost. The Alpha King would not know what his indifference had cost him. The system that had operated with such efficiency in its erasure of her would continue operating. Efficiently, confidently, completely unaware that the most significant succession event in its history had just walked out through its boundary with no fanfare, no announcement, no ceremony. Just silence. The same silence the pack had always offered her. She had finally learned how to use it. She planned her exit across the following days with the quiet focus of someone constructing something that needed to last. She moved resources. She identified her destination. Far enough to be genuinely beyond the reach of the pack's standard tracking operations. Developed enough to offer the infrastructure a hidden life required, connected to networks that owed no loyalty to pack hierarchy and had no interest in its politics. She said nothing to her family. Nothing to the sister, whose new position filled every corner of the pack's conversation. Nothing to the Alpha King, whose forward momentum, through his new political reality, carried not a single backward glance toward the space she had occupied. On the night she left, she did not look back. She carried two lives inside her, and the kind of silence that takes years to fill, or, in her case, to build something inside of. The pack noticed her absence within days. There was inquiry. Routine, administrative, brief. The Alpha King was informed. His response, relayed through the pack's channels, was a single notation of acknowledgement. She was removed from resident records. Her family expressed concern that dissipated within weeks beneath the momentum of the new Alpha Queen's installation ceremonies. She had been right. She had not mattered to the system. That knowledge did not break her. It was the first brick of everything she was about to build. Time operates differently when survival is the primary architecture. The first year was the hardest, not in the way she had anticipated hardness, not as emotional collapse or grief's acute paralysis, but as the specific, unrelenting demand of building a life from nothing, alone, in unfamiliar territory, while her body underwent the irreversible transformation of carrying two children to term without the infrastructure of any world that had ever claimed her. She gave birth in a facility she had chosen for its distance from pack-connected medical networks. Clean, competent, anonymous, a place where the staff asked no questions that their documentation did not require and remembered nothing beyond the boundaries of professional necessity. Toothed children. both unmistakably alpha-blooded. She could feel it in the particular quality of their energy, even as infants, a specific intensity, a presence that occupied space differently than ordinary children, a vitality that announced itself before it had any language or form to work through. They were his in ways that no documentation was needed to confirm. They carried the specific signature of power that the pack's bloodline recognition system had spent centuries developing tests for, and every measurement those tests were designed to find was present in her children before they could walk or speak. They were extraordinary. She held them in a room that belonged to no pack, no hierarchy, no political structure that had ever deemed her expendable, and she made the most important decision of her life in the quiet of that room, with no audience, no ceremony, no institutional witness to catalogue the moment. These children would never know weakness as their fundamental identity, not because weakness is shameful, but because the world had just demonstrated to her, with precise and public efficiency, what it does to people it assigns that identity to. She had been assigned it by a system that needed her to occupy that position, so other people's positions could be maintained. She had accepted it longer than she should have, because the bond she believed she shared with the Alpha King had felt like protection against the system's mathematics. It was not. Her children would not make the same error. They would be taught strength first, not the theatrical dominance of people who need to perform power because they feel its absence, but the quiet, architectural strength of people who have built something real and understand exactly what it is worth. They would be taught emotional intelligence before they were taught aggression. They would be taught that the most dangerous person in any room is almost never the loudest one. She would build them a world worth inheriting. And she would start by building herself into someone capable of doing that. The outer territory she had chosen operated on entirely different principles than the pack world she had left. Here, there were no hierarchies organized around bloodline designation. There were no council structures that determined your value based on your family's territorial holdings. There was only competence, demonstrated, repeatable, and ruthlessly evaluated by people who could not afford to be wrong about who they trusted with their operations. She was exceptionally competent. The pack hierarchy had never particularly valued what she was good at, because the pack hierarchy had never needed to. It had other mechanisms for resource allocation, other systems for territorial management, other people whose bloodline designations made them the first choice vessels for the kind of strategic intelligence she carried. She had lived her entire life watching less capable people occupy positions she could have performed better, protected from accountability by the structural guarantees of their pack status. In the outer territories, there were no structural guarantees, only results. She began small. Advisory work initially, the kind of consultation that outer territory operators needed but rarely had access to from someone with her specific combination of pack governance knowledge and political analytical capability. She was careful about her visibility. She used a constructed professional identity that communicated competence without inviting personal history. She built relationships based on demonstrated value rather than social architecture. Within 18 months, she had established the beginning of a genuine financial structure. Within 3 years she had become a recognized, if deliberately quiet, force in the outer territory's independent trade networks. People sought her assessments before making significant operational decisions. Her analysis was known to be precise, her judgment to be reliable, her willingness to maintain confidentiality to be absolute. She was building. Every resource that moved through her operation was allocated with the specific intentionality of someone constructing something that would eventually need to withstand significant political pressure. She built redundancy into every system. She cultivated relationships across multiple independent networks so that no single point of failure could collapse what she was creating. She kept careful, encrypted documentation of everything: her operational structure, her financial architecture, her legal standing in the outer territories, the specific framework of rights and protections that outer territory law provided her and her children. She was building a fortress. Not from stone, from information, from alliance, from the specific, quiet power of being someone that the people around you understand they cannot afford to lose. The twins grew inside this construction. They were remarkable in the ways she had anticipated from the moment of their birth, and in some ways that surprised even her deliberate preparation. They observed everything. They absorbed the operational logic of the world around them with an intelligence that exceeded their age consistently enough that she began adjusting how she communicated with them earlier than she had planned. By age 3, they were asking questions that required real answers. By age 4, they were beginning to understand the framework of the world they inhabited, why they lived beyond pack boundaries, why their mother operated with the specific kind of quiet authority that made grown adults defer to her judgment, why power was not something visible in the ways pack culture had always displayed it. She told them the truth, calibrated for what they were ready to receive. Their father was powerful. He had not known about them. They carried his strength and her intelligence, and that combination made them something that neither parent had fully understood was possible. She watched them absorb that information with the particular stillness of children who are processing something important and have been raised in an environment where important things are worth taking seriously. They would ask harder questions as they grew. She was prepared for that. At the 3-year mark, intelligence flowing through the outer territory networks she had built began producing information about the Alpha Kings pack that she filed without immediate response. The political alliance his advisors had engineered through her sister's selection was fracturing. The territorial stability it had promised had not materialized. Her sister's family had overextended in the years following the selection, pressing for resource arrangements and territorial concessions that the Alpha Kings Council had been unable to fully deliver without creating internal opposition from other pack factions. Elder alignments that had been carefully constructed over decades were developing stress fractures under the pressure of competing interests. The Alpha King was managing political erosion that his original calculation had not fully accounted for. She did not celebrate this. She filed it. She began monitoring his pack's internal situation with the patience of a chess player who has been building pieces across an entirely separate board while her opponent dismantled his own position. She was not yet planning action. She was building the complete picture, the kind of comprehensive situational understanding that would allow any eventual engagement from her to be precisely targeted rather than reactive. By the end of year 4 she had built something that the word operation no longer fully captured. It was, by any honest measurement, an empire, small by territorial comparison to the Alpha King's domain, but deep in the specific ways that mattered. Financially self-sustaining across multiple independent streams, politically protected by alliances with the outer territory's legitimate governance structures, legally documented with the thoroughness of someone who had anticipated the moment when those documents would be challenged, and staffed by people whose professional loyalty to her was based on years of demonstrated reciprocity rather than structural obligation. She was 30 years old. She had built in 4 years what would have taken 20 inside the pack's political architecture, if the pack's political architecture had ever permitted her to build at all. And then, in the 5th year, his trackers found her. The intelligence reached her 7 hours before they arrived at her outer territory's boundary. 7 hours. For a woman who had spent 5 years building contingency into every layer of her operation, 7 hours was not a crisis. It was an activation. She had not been careless. The finding did not come from an operational failure. After 5 years of precision, 5 years of building a hidden life with the methodical patience of someone who understood that every unexamined detail was a potential thread for a skilled tracker to pull, she had not been found through negligence. She had been found because the Alpha King had finally deployed resources at a scale his initial administrative indifference had never suggested he was capable of assembling for this purpose. 8 months of dedicated search operation, according to the intelligence her networks provided. 8 months of sustained attention directed toward a woman his pack records listed as a non-resident departure, the kind of sustained attention that meant something had shifted, something had changed inside his pack structure, or inside him personally, that elevated her disappearance from closed administrative matter to active priority. She spent a portion of those 7 hours analyzing the shift. The rest she spent activating the contingency architecture she had built specifically for this moment. The twins were relocated, not in panic, not with the reactive urgency of someone caught unprepared, but with the calm efficiency of a contingency that had been anticipated and prepared for across years of careful operational planning. They were moved to a location within her network that she had selected for exactly this scenario. Secure, comfortable, maintained by people whose loyalty she had spent years building into something structural rather than transactional. Her key allies in the outer territory were briefed. Her legal documentation, the specific, airtight framework she had spent years constructing with the outer territory's most capable legal architects, was organized and immediately accessible. Her financial architecture was positioned to withstand any attempted external pressure. And then she did what she had always known she would do when this moment arrived. She stayed. She sat in the primary space of her operation. The space that communicated, in every physical detail of its construction and furnishing, the scale and the nature of what she had built here. And she waited. The trackers arrived at her outer territory's operational boundary with the professional composure of people who had been deployed on serious assignments before. They were not unprepared for the outer territories. They were not unprepared for a woman who had been functioning independently for 5 years. They were entirely unprepared for her. What they found at the center of her operation was not the profile they had been briefed to expect. They had been sent to locate a woman in flight, possibly struggling, likely operating below the stability threshold, carrying the specific quality of compromised confidence that people display when they've been separated from their native infrastructure for extended periods. The standard profile of a pack member who had left the protection of pack structure and spent years surviving in the less governed outer territories. They found instead a woman who appeared to have been expecting them for approximately 5 years and had allocated exactly the right amount of preparation time. The space she occupied communicated its own authority before a single word was exchanged. Not through theatrical display, not through the performed dominance of someone who needs to assert power because they feel its instability, but through the quiet, absolute confidence of infrastructure. The physical evidence of genuine capability. The specific quality of composure that belongs only to people who have built something real and know precisely what it is worth. The trackers were trained professionals. They recovered their composure quickly. But she had seen the fracture in the first moment. She had catalogued it with the precision of someone who had spent 5 years studying exactly how power reads in the space between people. She sent them back with a message. Not a confrontation. She had not spent 5 years building toward a confrontation. Not an emotional declaration. She had no interest in performing her history for an audience that was reporting to the man who had created it. She sent them back with a message that was architectural in its precision. The terms under which she would agree to a meeting. Neutral territory of her selection. No pack escort inside the agreed perimeter. No legal or territorial claims initiated before the meeting concluded. A timeline of her setting, 3 days, not immediately, not reactively, but 3 days, which was exactly the amount of time she needed to ensure that every element of her preparation was complete. The terms were not aggressive. They were structural. They established, before the meeting began, that she was not the woman who had walked out of his territory 5 years ago in the immediate aftermath of public erasure. She was not negotiating from grief or from the diminished position of someone asking to be acknowledged by a greater power. She was setting the terms of an engagement between two parties, and she was setting them from a position of genuine operational authority. He accepted. The 3 days between the tracker's departure and the Alpha King's arrival were the most concentrated internal architecture she had ever constructed. She was not preparing emotionally for a reunion. She had spent 5 years processing the emotional content of their history in the specific, private hours that motherhood and empire building occasionally permitted, and she had arrived at a clarity about it that was complete enough to function around without being controlled by it. She was preparing strategically. She had run this meeting in her mind across 5 years of quiet preparation. She had modeled the variables, his emotional state, his political urgency, the specific configuration of need that would bring the Alpha King personally to the outer territories rather than sending representatives, and she had built response frameworks for every configuration she could anticipate. She knew him, or had known him. Before power calcified the version of him she had understood into the political instrument his council had needed him to become. She knew where the genuine person still lived beneath the institutional exterior. She knew how the revelation of the twins would land. Not abstractly, not as a political calculation, but as a human detonation in a man who had been operating for 5 years as though the cost of his indifference was contained. She prepared for the precise version of him that would emerge when that detonation happened. On the 3rd day, the Alpha King arrived. He came with a reduced presence, smaller escort than his standard political movement, stripped back from the scale that usually announced his physical arrival in any space. She had expected this. Part of it was compliance with her terms. Part of it, she assessed, was a personal choice, that he wanted this meeting to carry less of the institutional weight that surrounded every interaction in his public life. That whatever he had come to this territory to find, he wanted to find it with some version of himself that existed beneath the political armor. She received him in the space she had chosen. Her territory, the primary location of her operation, the physical evidence of 5 years of building presented without editorial comment as simply the environment in which she now conducted her affairs. She watched him register what he was looking at. She watched the composure he had walked in wearing. The trained, impenetrable composure of a king who has conducted significant negotiations across his entire adult life. Encounter the reality of what she had built, and recalibrate, and then recalibrate again when the initial adjustment proved insufficient. She was not the woman he had failed to look at during the selection ceremony. The version of her that stood in that space communicated an authority so far from the identity the pack's hierarchy had assigned her that the distance between the two versions was itself a form of accusation. She did not offer him reunion. She did not offer him accusation, either. That would have required an emotional investment in his response that she had spent 5 years learning to live without needing. She offered him information. She told him about the twins. She told him with the controlled, precise energy of a woman who has spent 5 years deciding exactly how this moment would be delivered, not for theatrical impact, not to perform her pain or her triumph, but because the information was the foundation of everything that followed, and it needed to be laid without distortion. She watched him receive it. She watched the specific quality of devastation that moved through a man who has just understood, in one breath, in one sentence, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the full scope of what his blindness had cost him. Not the political calculation of it. Not the succession implication of it. The human cost of it. The 5 years of it. The children who existed in the outer territories carrying his blood and his power markers and his specific intensity. Raised by a woman he had failed to look at, grown into people he did not know. She watched him process that. And she saw, in the specific quality of stillness that came over him in the aftermath of the processing, the first true shift in the power architecture between them. He had arrived as the Alpha King, conducting a territorial inquiry. He stood now as a man who had just discovered the full price of his indifference. She told him the twins existed. She told him they were well. She told him the terms under which any further conversation would proceed. Terms constructed across 5 years of understanding, exactly what needed to be protected, and exactly what leverage existed to protect it. She was not interested in his grief performing as adequate consequence for 5 years of erasure. She was interested in architecture. The meeting ended without resolution. She had not expected resolution. She had not built toward resolution. She had built toward the specific moment in which the Alpha King would leave her territory understanding, completely, with no room for administrative simplification, that the terms of every future engagement between them would be set by the woman he had once failed to look at. This room had always been hers. He left knowing it. The Alpha King's world does not maintain containment once a secret of this magnitude enters it. She had known this. She had always known this, had understood, from the moment she made the decision to disappear 5 years ago, that the eventual revelation of the twins' existence would function less like a disclosure and more like a detonation inside the pack's political architecture. The particular precision with which she had waited, the specific timing of when and how the information was delivered, had been calculated with exactly this in mind. Not revenge. Strategy. The distinction mattered to her. She had not spent 5 years in the outer territories constructing an empire around the single motivating desire to watch the Alpha King's political world collapse. She had spent those years protecting her children, building genuine power, and preparing for the inevitability that the world she had left would eventually require her engagement. The collapse of his political architecture was not the goal. It was the mathematical consequence of suppressed truth encountering the specific pressure of a system built on false foundations. Systems built on false foundations collapse when the truth enters them. She had simply given the truth optimal timing. The political implications inside his pack moved with the efficiency of a well-loaded mechanism finally released. His advisors, the same men who had designed the original selection ceremony as a territorial stability solution, now faced a succession architecture fundamentally altered by the existence of 2 alpha-blooded heirs from a prior bond. The Alpha Queen's position, which had been constructed with the assumption of unchallenged bloodline succession, was suddenly operating in a landscape where the pack's own bloodline recognition laws produced a very different answer than the one his council had intended to engineer. Pack elder factions that had been quietly organizing around competing interests for years found a legitimate succession question to coalesce around. His sister's family, which had been pressing political advantage since the installation ceremony, suddenly found themselves negotiating from a position that the revelation had fundamentally destabilized. And the Alpha King, who had spent 5 years operating with the forward momentum of a man whose succession architecture felt permanent, was now managing a political crisis whose depth and velocity his council had not anticipated because they had not known the variable that produced it existed. He came back to her. This time without the administrative framing of a territorial inquiry. This time without the controlled exterior of a king conducting official business. He came back as a man who was beginning, finally, years too late, to understand the complete geometry of what had happened. Not just the political dimensions of it. Not just the succession implications. The full geometry. What he had done, what it had cost her, what she had built in the space his indifference created, and what the total of all of those things meant for every negotiation they would ever have with each other. She received him on her terms again. The meeting that followed was the story's true reversal. Not a confrontation. She had never been interested in confrontation, which performs emotion without changing architecture. Not a reunion. The nature of what had been broken, and what had been built in its absence made reunion a category error, a simplification of something far more complex than personal reconciliation. What the meeting was a negotiation between two sovereign forces whose intertwined history had produced a leverage dynamic that only one of them had spent 5 years preparing for. He needed something. That was the fundamental shift. The Alpha King, who had spent his entire political life as the dominant force in every room, every negotiation, every power arrangement his pack structure had required him to navigate, needed something that only she could provide. He needed access to his children. He needed the legitimization of their existence inside his pack's formal record. He needed the political cover that her agreement to any kind of official acknowledgement would provide for a pack council now fracturing over succession uncertainty. He needed all of this urgently, and she had spent 5 years making herself the only person in the world who could give it to him. She listened to him build his case. She let him move through the full articulation of what he needed, what the political situation inside his pack had become, what the consequences of continued delay would produce. She watched him navigate the specific discomfort of a man who has never had to ask for something from someone he once made invisible. The discomfort of realizing that the power mathematics have inverted completely, and the position he now occupies is the one he once assigned to her. Then she told him what 5 years of silence cost. Not in cruelty. Not in the theatrical delivery of long-planned revenge satisfaction. In architecture. She presented him with a framework, the specific, carefully constructed set of terms she had been building toward across 5 years of operational preparation, for any formal involvement with the twins, and any official acknowledgement of their status. The terms were not punitive. They were structural. Formal recognition of the twins as his primary heirs, not as secondary political figures to be managed around existing alliance arrangements, not as complications to be acknowledged in qualified terms, but as the Alpha King's legitimate bloodline successors, with the full legal standing that designation carried in pack law. Recognition of her own status not as a returned pack member subject to his governance and his council's management, but as an independent sovereign with territorial authority equivalent to an allied power. Not subordinate, not provisional, but peer. And the provision that struck at the deepest layer of what the original ceremony had done to her, a formal pack record correction, entered into the permanent governance archive, establishing the complete history of what had happened, the selection, the departure, the 5-year absence, the twins' existence, without editorial softening or institutional management of the narrative. He did not agree immediately. She had not expected him to. Some of the terms required dismantling arrangements that his entire council's political careers had been built on defending. Some of them required a public acknowledgement of institutional failure that the pack's governance structure had every incentive to resist. He came back with modifications, with alternative frameworks, with the specific negotiating positions of a man who is not yet fully prepared to accept the complete scope of what is being asked. She held her terms. Not rigidly. She was too skilled a strategist for rigidity. She held them architecturally, meaning she understood which provisions were structural and which were negotiating surface, and she moved on the surface while protecting the structure with the patience of someone who understood that time was operating in her favor, not his. Because the Alpha King had something working against him that her terms did not create, but that her terms were designed to operate alongside. The twins themselves. He had seen them. She had permitted a brief, controlled introduction. Not as leverage theater, not as emotional manipulation, but as the specific acknowledgement that whatever negotiation was happening between the adults, the children at the center of it were real people whose existence deserved acknowledgement beyond the political utility of their bloodline. He had seen them. Whatever composure the Alpha King had maintained through the negotiations, the trained, professional composure of a man who had been conducting high-stakes political negotiations since early adulthood, did not survive direct encounter with two children who carried his exact energy signature, his power markers, his specific intensity, and who looked at him with a particular clear-eyed assessment of children who had been raised to take powerful people seriously without being overwhelmed by them. His children looked at him the way she had taught them to look at everyone. As someone whose reality could be accurately measured and responded to, without the distortions that performance and fear introduce. The Alpha King broke before she did. She had known he would. She had known it 5 years ago when she walked out of his territory, carrying his blood and her silence, and she had built her entire strategic architecture around the understanding that the moment he encountered what that silence had produced, the negotiating position he arrived with would not survive the encounter intact. He agreed to the terms. Not every provision in its initial form. Negotiations produce agreements, not capitulations, and she was too sophisticated to treat the distinction as a failure. But the agreement was foundationally on her framework, built on her terms, structured around her assessment of what the relationship between them and their children needed to be. He was not retrieving her. He was entering an alliance with her on a framework she had designed. The formal acknowledgement of the twins' status inside Pack law moved through his council with a specific, explosive political velocity she had anticipated. The succession architecture his advisors had spent years constructing, built on the assumption that the Alpha Queen's line was unchallenged, encountered the mathematical reality of bloodline law and began restructuring itself around the new facts. Elder factions that had been quietly positioning for years found the legitimate succession question they had been waiting for. Advisors whose careers had been built on the original ceremony's political logic found their positions immediately untenable. The Sisters' Alliance, the entire foundational justification for the selection ceremony, the territorial arrangement that had been supposed to secure the Pack's political future, fractured under the weight of what the twins' existence produced mathematically in succession terms. She watched it from her outer territory operation, with the calm of a chess player watching the board resolve itself into a configuration she had been building toward across 5 years of patient, invisible construction. She had not needed to be inside his pack to destroy the false architecture it was built on. She had simply needed to exist. The 5th year ended differently than any of the 4 that preceded it. It ended with a summit, not a personal meeting. Both of them had had enough of those to understand that personal meetings, however significant their content, operated in a different register than what this moment required. Not a negotiation. The foundational terms had been established across the preceding months with the specific, grinding patience of 2 sovereign powers whose histories were too entangled for simple resolution, and whose futures were too consequential for imprecision. A summit. Formal, recognized, attended by representatives of both his Pack Council and her Outer Territory Alliance, conducted in neutral space that both parties had agreed upon with the specificity that genuine diplomatic events require. The most significant territorial and succession realignment the region had seen in a generation. The twins were present for the formal opening. She had decided this deliberately, not as emotional display for the assembled representatives, not as leverage theater designed to affect the negotiating atmosphere, but as a concrete demonstration of what 5 years of her specific, intentional construction had produced. They were approaching 6 years old now, and they moved through the summit space with a quality of presence that required no announcement and generated no performance. They simply occupied the room. And the room responded to their occupation the way rooms respond to people who carry genuine power, with the specific, involuntary adjustment that the presence of authentic authority produces in people who are trained to recognize it. Every Pack elder in that room knew what they were looking at when the twins entered. Every member of her Outer Territory Alliance recognized the same thing, from a different analytical framework. The Alpha King's advisors, the ones who had survived the political restructuring of the preceding months, understood with the particular clarity that comes too late that 5 years ago a decision had been made that they had not fully measured the cost of. She watched the Alpha King watch his children move through the room. She had watched him do this before in briefer and more private moments across the negotiating period, had watched him encounter the specific, irreversible reality of what his indifference had built and destroyed simultaneously. She had watched him learn, in real time, the full scope of what had been lost, and she had watched him carry that knowledge with the dignity of a man who understood that the appropriate response to this particular accounting was not performed grief, but genuine reckoning. In this moment, in the formal space of the summit, watching his children carry themselves through a diplomatic environment with a quality of presence that he had not given them and could not have given them inside his pack's political structure, she saw something different move through him. Not grief, not guilt, not the specific devastation of realized loss. Recognition. The recognition of a man who was beginning to understand that what she had built in the outer territories, what she had built with his blood and her intelligence in the space that his indifference created, was not simply a rival power structure, or a political complication, or even an empire he had not anticipated. It was the best possible version of what their shared history could have produced. She had given his bloodline something his pack could not have given it. She had given it freedom, the specific freedom to become what it actually was, at its full native capacity, without the constraints of political management that pack hierarchy inevitably imposes on bloodlines it needs to keep in calibrated positions. The twins were not what pack succession planning would have made them. They were something more complete, more powerful in the specific ways that genuine power operates, more equipped for the world they would eventually need to navigate. She had done that. In the space his indifference created. The summit agreements took shape over 3 formal sessions with the precision that genuine diplomatic architecture requires. She had arrived at each session with the specific preparation of someone who had spent 5 years ensuring that this moment would be conducted on terms she had designed, and she navigated each session with the patience of someone who understood that the final architecture mattered more than any individual session's dynamics. The twins' succession status was codified in both Pack law and outer territory legal frameworks simultaneously, a dual recognition that her legal preparation had made constitutionally possible, and that as Pack's legal representatives had spent considerable effort attempting to consolidate into a single jurisdiction before accepting that her insistence on the dual framework was non-negotiable and legally sound. The dual recognition was not redundancy. It was insurance. The specific kind of insurance built by someone who understood that a system that had already erased her once might find the motivation to attempt it again, and that two independent legal architectures recognizing the same fact were exponentially more durable than one. Her outer territory operation was formally recognized as an independent allied entity, not a subordinate structure under his governance, not an extension of Pack territorial authority, but a pure sovereignty bound to his domain by alliance rather than hierarchy. The distinction was not semantic. It was structural. It meant that every future interaction between her operation and his Pack would be conducted between equals, with the rights and protections that equality provides. The sister's position was formally restructured. She had not designed the summit to destroy her sister. The relationship between them was too complicated for destruction to be an accurate description of what she wanted, and more practically, the restructuring that the twins' existence mathematically produced in succession terms had its own momentum that did not require her to design anything. The Alpha Queen's position had been built on a political foundation that the twins' existence fundamentally altered. The restructuring was legal, formal, complete, and produced by the Pack's own succession laws rather than by any agenda she had brought to the table. The final provision of the summit agreement was the one his advisors had argued against with the most sustained intensity: the permanent record. An entry into the Pack's governance archive, the same archive that recorded every Alpha King succession, every major territorial decision, every significant political event in the Pack's institutional history, documenting the complete sequence of events, the selection ceremony, the circumstances of her departure, the 5-year absence, the twins' existence and the conditions of their formal recognition. Not a confession. Not a punishment. Not a theatrical public reckoning designed to humiliate the Alpha King or destabilize his governance authority. A historical record. Permanent. Unalterable. Filed in the same institutional space as every other significant fact the Pack's governance structure had chosen to make part of its permanent memory. His advisors had argued that it was unnecessary, that the formal agreements themselves established the relevant facts without requiring a narrative account, that it created political vulnerability without corresponding benefit, that it was punitive in effect even if not in stated intent. She had held the provision without modification across 3 sessions of negotiation, because she understood something his advisors did not, or understood but were unwilling to admit. The provision was not about punishment. It was about permanence. It was the specific difference between an arrangement that powerful people could eventually revise, reframe, and quietly redescribe to future generations, and an arrangement that had been filed into the institutional record in terms precise enough that revision would require the explicit acknowledgement of what was being changed. It meant that every Pack member who came after them, every successor who reviewed the archive in the execution of their governance responsibilities, every future historian of this territory would encounter the complete story. The woman who had been made invisible by the system's indifference, who had disappeared with the Alpha King's heirs, who had built an empire in the outer territories across 5 years, and who had returned, not to beg for reintegration, not to settle for acknowledgement, but to restructure the political architecture of an entire region on the terms she had spent 5 years designing. The Alpha King, sitting across the summit table in the final session, looked at the permanent record provision one last time before signing the agreement. She watched him read it with the attention of a man who understood exactly what he was authorizing. He signed. In the quiet after the session. After the formal procedures had concluded, after the representatives had moved through the congratulatory protocols that diplomatic events require, after the administrative machinery had begun the process of implementing what had been agreed, she sat in the summit space with the specific quality of stillness that comes after 5 years of sustained architectural tension finally reached their design conclusion. She was not euphoric. She had never been building toward euphoria. She was satisfied in the way that architects are satisfied, not by the emotional catharsis of a dramatic moment, but by the specific, durable satisfaction of a structure built correctly, standing as designed, doing what it was built to do. She had walked out of the Alpha King's territory 5 years ago with 2 lives inside her, and a silence so complete that the pack had closed over her absence within weeks, had removed her from its records with a single administrative notation, had celebrated its new future without a moment's acknowledgement of what it had dismissed. She was sitting now as the architect of the most significant political realignment the region had seen in a generation. The pack's permanent record now contained her name. Not as a notation of departure, not as an administrative reference, but as a sovereign force whose history the pack's institutional memory was now required to carry without editorial management. The twins, watching their mother finalize the last procedural elements of the summit agreements across the room, carried the specific observational stillness that had been their operating mode from infancy. Watching everything, absorbing everything, measuring the world against the internal frameworks she had been building in them since before they could speak. They were her children. They were his heirs. They were something neither system had anticipated. She had built them a world worth inheriting. And she had built it, with extraordinary precision, in the exact space that the world had created when it decided she did not matter. The most powerful person in any room is often the one everyone else forgot to monitor. She had spent 5 years being forgotten. She would not be forgotten again. Power is not taken. It is built. In silence. In the dark. By the people everyone else decided were finished.